Imagine holding a physical manual in your hands. But, this isn't the manual for your car or a piece of software or even like a medical textbook.
Right.
It is a manual that attempts to explain with absolute authority the entire operational framework of reality. You open it up, and on one page, it is detailing the microscopic, almost obsessive minutia of ancient agricultural laws.
Yeah, down to the seed.
Exactly. And then you flip the page, and suddenly it is giving you the strict, unyielding, life-or-death protocols for how to legally validate a prophet, someone who claims to speak for God.
Which is quite the pivot.
It really is. You flip another page, and it abruptly shifts from law to overarching philosophy, laying out the ultimate teleological purpose of human existence, like the actual reason you, specifically, are alive.
It's basically the ultimate theory of everything document. But it's constructed not through physics, but through jurisprudence and theology.
And here is the context that makes it so compelling. This manual was written over 8 centuries ago by a man named Moses Maimonides, often referred to by his Hebrew acronym, Rambam. And he wrote it as an introduction to another text, the Mishnah, which is itself 1,800 years old.
Right. It's ancient.
We are looking at a transmission of human knowledge that has survived the rise and fall of multiple empires, the shifting of continents, and the complete transformation of global civilization.
And, it hasn't just survived in a glass museum case somewhere. It has remained meticulously intact. It's constantly debated, heavily scrutinized, and actively applied to the everyday lives of millions of people for millennia.
Which is exactly why we are taking a deep dive into this text today, Maimonides' introduction to the Mishnah. If you are listening to this right now, you might hear the phrase 12th century theological introduction and assume we are about to slog through something incredibly dry.
Oh, yeah. Sounds like a textbook.
Right. But stick with us because this document is actually a masterclass in epistemology.
It absolutely is. And epistemology is simply the study of knowledge, right? How we know what we know and how we differentiate a justified belief from just, well, mere opinion. Maimonides is tackling the ultimate epistemological nightmare here. How do you verify truth across a span of thousands of years?
We are going to explore the mechanics of how information can survive across generations without degrading into myth. We are going to dissect his rigorous framework for handling intellectual disputes, like examining why genuinely brilliant people look at the exact same data and, arrive at totally different conclusions.
Which is super relevant today.
So relevant. And finally, we will unpack Maimonides' staggeringly pragmatic and perhaps controversial vision of what the human species is actually designed to do.
Yeah, it's a profound philosophical treatise hiding inside a legal index. And to understand what he is doing, you really have to look at how he opens the text. He doesn't start with dry legalese. He begins with a highly poetic, almost majestic invitation.
He compares his commentary to a well-prepared banquet, and a fortified tower, and a planted vineyard. It's incredibly vivid. He tells the reader that he has spent years gathering his ingredients from the vast ocean of preceding Jewish scholarship.
Right.
But before we get into what he built, we should probably define the materials he's using, because he drops some heavy terminology right out of the gate. He mentions drawing from the Talmud, the Tosefta, and the Geonim.
Yeah, and understanding those sources is crucial to grasping the sheer scale of his project. The Talmud, as many might know, is the massive, multi-volume compilation of Jewish law and debate, finalized around the year 500 CE.
Okay.
But Maimonides also cites the Tosefta. The Tosefta literally means the additions. These were the contemporaneous supplementary traditions and teachings from the era of the Mishnah that didn't quite make it into the final official cut of the primary text. But they still hold immense legal weight.
So they're like the B-sides or the director's cut of the primary oral law.
That's a great way to put it. Exactly. And then he mentions the Geonim. Now, the Geonim were the brilliant intellectual titans, the presidents of the great Babylonian rabbinic academies, who operated roughly from the year 600 to 1000 CE.
They are the bridge.
Right. They were the bridge between the ancient world of the Talmud and the medieval world of Maimonides. They answered legal questions for the entire global Jewish diaspora.
Uh-huh.
So Maimonides is essentially saying, I have synthesized the entire intellectual output of the Jewish people for the last 1,000 years.
Wow. But then he hits the brakes. Before he writes a single word about the actual laws of agriculture or marriage or damages, he realizes he has a fundamental problem. If he is going to build this massive legal architecture, he has to establish the bedrock of its authority.
He does.
And for his framework, that absolute bedrock is the historical event at Mount Sinai. But what I find fascinating is how he writes about Sinai.
It is arguably the most telling part of his entire philosophical profile. I mean, when most people, or even theologians, describe the revelation at Mount Sinai, they focus on the cinematic elements. You know, the thunder, the lightning, the smoke, the voice of God splitting the heavens.
The Hollywood version.
Precisely. The Charlton Heston movie. Maimonides entirely ignores the pyrotechnics. He is utterly uninterested in the special effects. What Maimonides cares about is the logistics of the pedagogy, the specific mechanical transmission of data.
Because he knows his reader has the exact same skepticism that a modern reader has. I mean, we all know the telephone game.
Oh, yeah.
You sit in a circle in kindergarten, you whisper, "I like baked beans," to the kid next to you, and by the time it gets around the room, the last kid yells, "Aliens are wearing jeans." It's a fun game because human communication is naturally flawed. We just assume that over centuries, an entirely oral history must completely degrade.
Right, and Maimonides sets out to completely shatter that assumption. He wants to prove that the transmission of the oral law was not a game of whispers, but an institutionalized, ironclad, almost mathematical system of peer-reviewed memorization.
Let's walk through the mechanics of this, because it is staggering to think about the cognitive load involved here. Maimonides outlines a highly specific four-step pedagogical method. Let's set the physical scene. God teaches Moses a commandment, along with its detailed practical explanation. Now, Moses has the complete data packet. He enters his tent.
Okay, so that brings us to step one. Aaron, Moses' brother and the high priest, enters the tent. Moses teaches him the commandment and the detailed oral explanation. He recites it perfectly. Once Aaron has absorbed it, he physically moves to Moses' right side, remaining in the room.
So Aaron has heard it once.
Step two. Aaron's sons, Eleazar and Ithamar, enter the tent. Moses becomes a lecturer again. He teaches them the exact same lesson. Now, think about the acoustic environment of the room.
Aaron is still there.
Right. Aaron is sitting right there listening. So as Moses teaches the sons, Aaron is hearing the lesson for a second time. Once the sons understand it, they move to the sides of the room.
Okay, keeping track of the repetitions here. Aaron is at 2, the sons are at 1.
Step 3 introduces the broader leadership. The 70 elders of Israel, the supreme judicial body, enter the tent. Moses delivers the lesson for a third time. Now the elders are hearing it for their first time, but the sons are hearing it for their second time. And Aaron, sitting quietly by Moses, is hearing it for his third time.
It's a cascading algorithm of memory reinforcement.
Exactly. And then we reach step 4. The doors are open to the entire congregation, the general public, anyone seeking the law. Moses teaches the lesson one final time.
So before Moses even stands up to leave, let's look at the result. The general public has heard it once. The 70 elders have heard it twice. The sons have heard it 3 times. And Aaron, the high priest, has heard the exact same lesson perfectly recited 4 times.
And at this point, Maimonides notes, Moses exits the tent. His job as the primary transmitter for this specific law is done. But the process is only halfway complete. The cycle immediately reverses.
Moses is gone, so Aaron, the guy who just heard it 4 times and presumably has it burned into his neurological pathways, takes the floor. He becomes the teacher. He recites the exact same lesson to everyone remaining in the room.
Which means now Aaron's sons have heard it 4 times. Aaron then exits. His sons take the floor. They deliver the lesson.
Now the 70 elders have hit their 4th repetition. The sons leave.
Finally, the 70 elders take the floor and they teach the congregation. So ultimately, every single demographic tier, from the highest priest to the average citizen, hears the lesson exactly 4 times, but critically, from different authoritative sources.
I am fascinated by the psychology of this. If you study modern learning theories, spaced repetition and hearing the same information from multiple varied sources is the single most effective way to lock data into long-term memory.
Absolutely.
It prevents an individual's personal bias or mispronunciation from corrupting the core message. Like, if Aaron mumbled a word, the elders would catch it when they taught it, because the congregation had already heard it from Moses. It's a self-correcting neural network of humans.
And Maimonides adds that the process didn't stop in the tent. The people would then disperse into their own camps and study groups, reciting the lesson to each other, testing each other, until the oral explanation was perfectly memorized. Only after the oral comprehension was absolute would they physically write down the shorthand text of the commandment on scrolls.
That is a massive distinction Maimonides makes, the difference between the written law and the oral law. According to the text, right before Moses dies, he acts as a scribe. He physically writes down 13 Torah scrolls, 1 for each of the 12 tribes, and a master copy for the tribe of Levi. That written text is locked. but the explanations of that text, the actual how-to manual, were intentionally kept completely oral.
Yeah, and Maimonides gives a highly practical example to demonstrate why an oral explanation isn't just a supplement, but an absolute necessity. He points to the biblical commandment to dwell in a sukkah, a temporary booth used during the autumn festival of Sukkot. If you only look at the physical scroll, the written text simply says, "You shall dwell in booths for 7 days."
Which, legally speaking, is a nightmare of ambiguity. I mean, what constitutes a booth? Is a cardboard box a booth?
Right.
Can I build it out of synthetic plastics? Does it have a height limit? If I build a booth 2 inches tall and stick my finger in it, have I fulfilled my legal obligation?
Exactly. Without context, the written law is completely unexecutable. Maimonides points out that the oral explanation, the data transmitted through that rigorous 4-step method, contained all the actual engineering parameters. The oral tradition specified that the sukkah must be at least 7 handbreadths long, 7 handbreadths wide, and exactly 10 handbreadths tall.
Okay, so very specific dimensions.
Yes. And it specified that the roof, the shash, must be made exclusively of plant material that grew from the ground and has been detached. It cannot be woven wool, cannot be silk, it cannot be animal hide. It also contained the exemptions, like that travelers or those who are ill are not obligated to sleep in it.
It's as if the written Torah is just the bullet point syllabus for a college course, but the oral law is the actual semester of university lectures where you learn how to do the math.
That is a perfect analogy. The written text is essentially a mnemonic device, a shorthand anchor designed to trigger the massive repository of the memorized oral tradition.
Okay, let me challenge the premise here, though. I understand Maimonides is building this fortress around the idea of a perfect transmission, but let's look at human reality. You can design the most rigorous top-down communication strategy in corporate history or the military. The general gives the order to the colonel briefs the captain drills the sergeant tells the private.
Sure.
But humans get tired. Humans get distracted. Situations change that the original briefing didn't cover. If this 4-step transmission from Moses was so immaculate, why is the Talmud, which Maimonides himself relies on, absolutely overflowing with vicious, entrenched legal disagreements? The sages in these texts are constantly arguing over what the law actually is.
That is the central driving tension of his entire introduction. If the system is perfect, why is there chaos?
Yeah.
He is fully aware of this paradox and he resolves it brilliantly. But before he can explain why the sages argue, he realizes he has to close a theological loophole. He has to explain what happens when a legal dispute arises and someone tries to bypass the human legal system entirely by claiming a direct hotline to God.
Ah, prophecy.
Exactly.
Because if 2 brilliant rabbis are arguing over a property law, the most efficient way to solve the dispute wouldn't be to vote. It would be to just find a prophet and say, hey, can you ask God what the answer is?
Logically, that seems like the ultimate trump card. But Maimonides takes a profound detour into the mechanics of prophecy, specifically to explain why using a prophet to settle a legal dispute is absolutely categorically forbidden. And in doing so, he completely redefines the concept of a prophet for his readers.
Well, the pop culture idea of a prophet is basically a wizard. It's someone who stands on a mountain, parts a sea, brings down fire from the sky, or predicts the future, specifically to prove to the masses, look at my magic. I am God's representative.
Right, and Maimonides rejects that theatrical definition entirely. He states unequivocally that a prophet's core role is not to perform miracles as a validation of their office. He looks at the historical record of the Hebrew Bible. He points to Elijah and Elisha, who did perform staggering miracles, reviving a dead child or curing Naaman of leprosy.
Pretty big miracles.
Yeah, but Maimonides argues they performed those acts out of urgent practical necessity or deep compassion for individuals in distress. They did not do them as a parlor trick to prove they were prophets.
So if a prophet isn't defined by magic tricks, what are the parameters? Maimonides lays out a ruthless boundary right away. He deals with the idolatrous prophet. If someone walks into the town square and says, a star communicated with me, or the spirit of this specific idol gave me a revelation about the future, the legal response is immediate. They are classified as a false prophet and, under ancient jurisprudence, subjected to the death penalty by strangulation.
It's severe.
Very. There is no trial to see if their prediction comes true. There is no asking them for a sign.
Because the fundamental non-negotiable premise of the entire Maimonidean legal and philosophical system is the absolute unity and singularity of God. To claim revelation from an astrological body or a physical idol is an act of cosmological treason. It fundamentally contradicts the operating system of reality.
But his restrictions on true prophets, the ones who genuinely speak in the name of the God of Israel, are even more fascinating. He establishes a complete lockdown on the law. A validated, authentic prophet absolutely cannot permanently add or subtract a single detail from the Torah.
This is Maimonides acting as the ultimate constitutional lawyer. He is establishing an ironclad separation of powers. The legislative phase of human history, which occurred at Mount Sinai, is permanently closed.
He gives some wild hypotheticals to prove this point. He says, imagine a well-known, totally verified prophet comes to town. He gathers the leaders and says, God spoke to me last night and informed me that the waiting period for eating fruit from a newly planted tree, which is a law known as Orla, and it's biblically set at 3 years. God told me it is now only 2 years. What is the legal response?
The legal response is that this man is now a false prophet. He must be executed. No amount of miracles he performs in that moment can save him. If he turns a stick into a snake or makes the sun stand still, it is irrelevant. The law cannot be amended by prophecy.
And he gives another example regarding interpretation. Let's say there is a law that the entire oral tradition agrees is metaphorical. For example, the biblical verse about civil damages that says you should cut off her hand. The unbroken oral tradition, delivered to Moses, states that this means paying monetary compensation for the damage, not actual physical mutilation.
Right.
If a prophet suddenly announces, I had a vision, the rabbis are wrong, God meant it literally, go get the axe. Same exact result. False prophet. Maimonides grounds this in a famous Talmudic principle. It is not in heaven. The law was given to humanity at Sinai. It now resides entirely within the domain of human intellect and judicial reasoning. Divine inspiration has zero jurisdiction in the Supreme Court of Jewish law. If a prophet attempts to use a divine vision to settle a debate between two sages or to change a precedent, they instantly invalidate themselves. I cannot overstate what a massive paradigm shift this is for how we view ancient religion. I mean, we tend to view religious systems as constantly waiting for the next divine update, like a modern app constantly getting patches from the developer. Maimonides is saying, no, we have the source code. The developer is not sending any more patches. It is entirely up to us to run the software.
Exactly. It empowers human reason above continuous divine intervention. However, as with any robust legal system, there must be a mechanism to handle catastrophic emergencies. Maimonides details the singular exception to this rule. It is a legal concept called horat shah, which translates roughly to a temporary ruling or a ruling for the hour.
So a validated prophet can order a temporary suspension of a law, but only under incredibly specific crisis conditions.
Yes, and Maimonides uses the biblical story of the prophet Elijah on Mount Carmel as the ultimate precedent. According to the foundational law, once the Holy Temple was established in Jerusalem, it became strictly biblically forbidden to offer animal sacrifices anywhere else in the world. Doing so carried the severe spiritual penalty of excision.
But Elijah builds an altar and offers a sacrifice on Mount Carmel, which is in northern Israel, far away from Jerusalem. He does this in a public showdown to defeat the priests of the idol Baal. Under normal law, Elijah should be condemned.
But because he is a recognized prophet utilizing horat shah, it is permitted. He is suspending the law temporarily to save the nation from spiraling into total idolatry. Maimonides even updates the concept for his readers. He says, if a prophet came today and ordered the Jewish army to actively break the Sabbath laws, which are incredibly strict in order to fight a war or secure the nation, you are legally obligated to violate the Sabbath and listen to the prophet.
But the safeguard here is the intent of permanence. If the people pull Elijah aside after the fire comes down on Mount Carmel and say, that was amazing, does this mean the Jerusalem monopoly is over? Can we just build altars in our backyards from now on?
If Elijah answers yes, he immediately becomes a false prophet. He's required to say, no, this is strictly a temporary emergency measure. Tomorrow, the law returns to normal.
Okay, I have a conceptual hurdle here. You've established that miracles do not prove a prophet is real, and you've established that they are forbidden from changing the law or solving legal disputes. So what is their actual utility? And more importantly, how do you verify them? If I can't ask them to perform a magic trick, and I can't ask them a legal question, what is the standardized test for prophecy?
Maimonides outlines an incredibly sophisticated asymmetrical test of prediction. The primary test of a prophet is simply whether the future events they predict actually come to pass. But, and this is where his psychological brilliance shines, it is not a simple binary pass-fail grade.
I'm struggling to reconcile that. I mean, if I claim to speak for the creator of the universe, and I predict it's going to rain on Tuesday and Tuesday is sunny, haven't I just objectively proven I'm a fraud?
Not necessarily, and it depends entirely on the nature of the prediction. Maimonides distinguishes between prophecies of doom and prophecies of peace. If a prophet predicts a massive disaster, a famine, a plague, a devastating war, and that disaster fails to happen, they are not automatically deemed a false prophet.
How does he justify that legally?
Because of the theological premise that God is fundamentally merciful. A prophecy of doom is essentially a warning. It is designed to provoke behavioral change. Maimonides cites the biblical narrative of King Ahab. Elijah prophesied total destruction for Ahab because of his profound wickedness. But Ahab actually listened. He tore his clothes, put on sackcloth, and humbled himself. And because he repented, God delayed the punishment. The disaster didn't happen when predicted.
Oh, wow. So a failed prophecy of doom just means the warning worked and God exercised mercy. It doesn't mean the prophet was lying.
Correct, but here is the critical asymmetry. What happens if a prophet predicts peace and prosperity? If they say, next year the economy will boom, there will be no war, and everyone will be healthy, and then a famine strikes?
Then what? Can they say, oh, the people sinned, so God took away the good stuff?
No. Maimonides states that if a positive prophecy fails to materialize, the person is definitively, undeniably a false prophet. Good prophecies, once issued unconditionally by God through a prophet, cannot be retracted. God's mercy allows for the cancellation of punishment, but his faithfulness prevents the cancellation of a promised blessing.
That is a fascinating legal trap for charlatans. The source text brings up a real historical debate to illustrate this, a confrontation between Jeremiah and Hananiah ben Azur, and the historical context here makes the stakes incredibly high. This is happening right as the Babylonian Empire is threatening to annihilate Jerusalem.
Exactly. The city is in a state of absolute panic. Jeremiah, the true prophet, is walking the streets delivering prophecies of doom. He is telling the king, Babylon is going to destroy this city, the temple will burn, we are going to exile. It is the message no one wants to hear.
And then you have Hananiah. He stands up in the temple and delivers a prophecy of peace. He says, don't worry, God told me Babylon will be broken, the holy vessels they already stole will be returned within 2 years, everything is going to be fine. He is telling the people exactly what their terrified minds desperately want to believe.
And Jeremiah's response to Hananiah is the legal foundation for Maimonides' rule. Jeremiah essentially says to him, look, I am predicting destruction. If my prophecy doesn't happen, it doesn't prove I'm a fake. It just means God decided to be merciful. But you, Hananiah, are predicting peace. If your 2 years pass and those vessels aren't back, you will be exposed as a liar because God does not revoke a promise of peace.
It's a psychological masterstroke. It prevents religious grifters from simply walking around promising everyone health, wealth, and military victory just to gain followers. Because the absolute second their positive prediction fails, the legal framework demands their execution as a false prophet.
So if we look at the architecture Maimonides has built so far, he has proven the transmission at Sinai was perfectly reliable. And he has securely locked the back door of prophecy, ensuring no one can use divine claims to interfere with human jurisprudence.
Which brings us crashing right back into the central paradox. If the Sinai transmission was flawless and prophets can't mess with the law, why are the scholars arguing? Why is the Talmud essentially a massive encyclopedia of brilliant men fiercely disagreeing with each other?
To resolve this, Maimonides essentially writes an exhaustive anatomy of legal disagreement. He categorizes the entirety of Jewish law into 5 distinct categories. By doing this, he can pinpoint exactly where disagreement is logically impossible and where it is an inevitable byproduct of human cognition.
Let's walk through these 5 categories because this is the absolute core of his legal philosophy. Category 1 is received interpretations with textual hints.
Right. These are the core explanations of the written Torah that were explicitly given to Moses at Sinai, and critically, they have some kind of linguistic or contextual hint within the written text itself.
The example Maimonides uses here is the etrog. On the holiday of Sukkah, the Torah commands the taking of the fruit of a beautiful tree. Now, beautiful tree is incredibly vague. It could be an apple, a pomegranate, a perfectly shaped pear.
Sure.
But Maimonides points out that there has never been a historical dispute about what fruit that verse refers to. From the moment Joshua entered the land of Israel up to Maimonides' own day in the 12th century, it was universally known and accepted to be the etrog, the citron. No sage ever woke up one morning and argued for a lemon.
Because the transmission was unbroken. Now, a later sage might write a brilliant essay finding linguistic clues in the Hebrew word for beautiful to prove why it has to be the etrog, but they are just finding retroactive textual support for a tradition they already possess. In Category 1, the system worked perfectly. Zero disputes.
Which leads to Category 2, Halakha Lamosh Sinai. This literally translates to a law to Moses from Sinai. These are received traditions that have absolutely no hint in the written text. They exist entirely outside the biblical manuscript.
Maimonides lists several fascinating examples here. One is the concept of shimmering, or legal measurements. The Torah might say, do not eat a certain forbidden fat, but it never defines the volume. Is it a microscopic crumb? A pound?
Right.
The oral tradition from Sinai established the standard measurements, for example. That liability usually begins at the volume of an olive.
Another great example he gives is the straps of the tefillin, the leather phylacteries worn during morning prayers. The tradition states the straps must be black. There is zero mention of black leather anywhere in the Torah. It is purely an oral law. Or the specific age milestones, like the legal status of a minor girl being under the age of 3 years and 1 day.
And again, Maimonides is emphatic here. In Category 2, there are no disputes. Not a single sage ever argued that tefillin straps should be red or blue. The ancient data transfer held strong.
So Categories 1 and 2 represent the flawless execution of the pedagogical system, the memory held. But then we hit Category 3, laws derived via reasoning. And this is where the intellectual sparks start flying.
This is where human intellect becomes the primary engine of the law. You see, the laws given at Sinai couldn't possibly account for every single technological, economic, or social variable that would arise over thousands of years. So when the sages encountered a completely new situation that wasn't explicitly covered by Categories 1 or 2, they had to use logic to figure out what God would want them to do.
And they had a specific toolkit for this, right? The 13 hermeneutical principles.
Yes. These were universally accepted, formalized rules of logical deduction and inference. The most famous is the Calvi Chomer, which is an argument a fortiori.
Let's define that for the listener because it's a foundational concept in legal theory.
An argument a fortiori basically means from the stronger to the weaker, or vice versa. In modern legal terms, if the law states that a minor traffic violation carries a mandatory $100 fine, then logically, by a fortiori reasoning, a major, dangerous, reckless driving offense must carry at least a $100 fine, if not much more. If the minor case is strict, the major case must be equally or more strict.
So the sages would take these 13 logical tools and apply them to new societal problems. And because human intellect varies, because your brain processes analogies differently than my brain, this is exactly where disputes happen.
Inevitably. Two brilliant sages look at a new economic crisis. They both use the 13 principles perfectly. But one sage leans heavily on a textual analogy, and the other relies on a fortiori deduction. They arrive at mutually exclusive legal conclusions. Neither forgot the tradition, they're just utilizing their cognitive processing power differently.
And when you have two recognized experts in a deadlock, how does the system move forward?
They fall back on a biblical mandate majority rule. They literally take a vote. After the majority, you shall incline. The law follows the consensus of the court.
I think the best modern analogy for this is the United States Supreme Court. The Constitution is the written text. The Fourth Amendment protects against unreasonable searches and seizures of your persons, houses, papers, and effects. That text is locked, but suddenly it's 2014, and the police want to search a suspect's smartphone without a warrant. The founders at Sinai, or in this case, Philadelphia, didn't say a word about digital encryption.
Exactly. So what happens? The 9 justices have to use hermeneutical reasoning to apply the old text to the new reality. Is a smartphone a paper? Is it an effect?
And you are going to have brilliant legal minds arguing passionately, writing scathing dissents, completely disagreeing with each other on how to apply the Fourth Amendment to a smartphone. Maimonides is saying that when the justices argue, it doesn't mean the Constitution is broken or that they forgot what it says. It means the system is working exactly as designed. It is human intellect actively engaging with the architecture of the law.
Which brings Maimonides to a defensive posture. He feels he absolutely must defend the honor of the sages against a very common, very cynical misinterpretation of history. There is a famous, somewhat lamenting quote in the Talmud that says, "When disciples of Shammai and Hillel multiplied who did not serve their masters enough, disputes multiplied in Israel."
Now, if you just read that on the surface, it sounds like an admission of failure. It sounds like the older generation was saying, these kids today are lazy, they didn't study hard enough, they forgot the oral traditions of their teachers, and now they're just arguing out of sheer ignorance.
Maimonides aggressively, fiercely rejects that interpretation. He calls the idea that the sages simply forgot the traditions ugly and logically absurd. He insists that the traditions of Categories 1 and 2 were perfectly intact.
So how does he explain the quote? What does "did not serve their masters enough" actually mean in his view?
He argues it is entirely about cognitive capacity. Hillel and Shammai were intellectual titans of the first century. Their capacity for pure, abstract, logical reasoning was practically superhuman, and critically, their logic was almost always perfectly aligned. Because their reasoning was so sharp, they arrived at the same conclusions. But their hundreds of students, they were brilliant, but their analytical processing power was slightly weaker than their masters.
They had slightly slower CPUs in their heads?
In a sense, yes. So, when applying the 13 principles to new cases in Category 3, their slightly weaker reasoning led them down different logical pathways, resulting in different conclusions. The explosion of dispute wasn't born of amnesia or laziness. It was born of cognitive variance in applying logic to novel situations. Maimonides has a profound, almost reverent respect for variations in human intellect.
Okay, let's round out the final two categories of his legal anatomy. Category 4, decrees or gezero.
These are essentially legal fences. The sages would deliberately prohibit an action that is technically biblically permitted in order to create a buffer zone so people wouldn't accidentally violate a severe biblical law.
The sociology of boundaries. The source text gives a highly practical example, eating poultry with milk. The biblical law strictly forbids boiling a kid in its mother's milk, which the oral tradition defined as a blanket ban on cooking or eating mammalian meat with dairy. But poultry chickens, ducks, turkeys, they don't produce milk. They aren't mammals. So technically, biblically speaking, you could eat a chicken parmesan.
But the sages looked at human behavior. They realized that if people get used to eating chicken cooked in cheese, a less educated person might see that, think it's veal, and assume mixing beef and cheese is perfectly fine. The visual similarity creates a risk. So the sages enacted a decree, a fence, forbidding poultry with milk to protect the core biblical law.
Now, in Category 4, disputes do happen, but usually only in the proposal phase. One sage might look at the society and say, we need a fence here. Another sage might argue, no, that's an overreach, the public can handle the nuance.
But Maimonides notes a critical rule here. Once a decree is debated, voted on, and universally accepted by the collective body of Israel, it becomes unshakable. The source states that once a decree is universally adopted, not even a prophet can undo it. The authority of the collective consensus is actually stronger than individual divine revelation.
Wow. And finally, we have Category 5, regulations and customs known as takanot.
These are purely social, economic, or monetary ordinances enacted by the courts for the public good to ensure a functioning ethical society.
The classic, brilliant example given in the text is an innovation by Hillel called the prosbul. To understand this, we have to look at the ancient agrarian economy. Biblical law mandates a sabbatical year every 7 years. During this year, all agricultural work stops, but critically, all private debts are universally forgiven and wiped clean.
It was a divine mechanism to prevent generational poverty and permanent wealth consolidation. A beautiful concept in theory.
But Hillel looked at the reality of the first century economy. As the 7th year approached, wealthy people simply stopped lending money to the poor. They knew that if they lent someone 100 silver coins in year 6, the debt would be wiped out in year 7. The credit market completely froze. The poor were starving because no one would give them a loan, which actively violated the biblical commandment to help the needy.
So Hillel instituted a legal workaround, a takana, called the prosbul. It was essentially a contract that transferred the private debt to the public court. The sabbatical year only cancels private loans between individuals. Debts owed to the court system are exempt. By utilizing this legal loophole, lenders felt secure that their money would be repaid via the court, the credit markets reopened, and the poor were able to get the loans they needed to survive.
It's a breathtaking example of the legal system using a Category 5 regulation to adapt an ancient law to save a contemporary economy.
Exactly. So Maimonides has categorized the law. But there's the lingering philosophical question here, specifically about Category 3 and Category 4, where all these arguments take place. If the system operates on majority rule and a final verdict is reached, why does the Mishnah bother recording all the losing minority opinions?
Yeah, I mean, if you actually open the Mishnah, it doesn't read like a clean rule book. It's constantly saying, Rabbi Meir says you are liable, but Rabbi Judah says you are exempt. If Rabbi Judah won the vote and his opinion is the law, why use precious ink and memory space to immortalize Rabbi Meir's rejected argument?
Maimonides provides two profound reasons, drawing straight from the Mishnah's own self-awareness. First, it is about maintaining extreme legal adaptability. A future Supreme Court, living maybe 3 centuries later, facing a completely different economic or technological landscape, might find that the majority precedent no longer serves justice. They might need to rely on the underlying logic of that old minority opinion. By recording it, the Mishnah preserves it as a valid, albeit currently dormant, line of reasoning that can be legally reactivated as circumstances demand it.
Going back to our Supreme Court analogy, it is exactly the function of a dissenting opinion. A dissent written in 1920 doesn't have the force of law, but a court in 1960 might cite that exact dissent to overturn a precedent and establish a new legal paradigm.
Precisely. The text is a living repository of potential logic. But the second reason Maimonides gives is purely moral. Recording the disputes teaches intellectual humility. He points out that the text specifically praises the students of Hillel. Why are they the heroes? Because occasionally they would engage in a fierce debate with their rivals, the students of Shammai. And during the debate, the Hillelites would realize that Shammai's logical argument was actually superior to their own.
And instead of digging their heels in out of pride, they would concede the point. They would retract their own ruling, adopt their opponent's logic, and vote against themselves.
As the phrase goes, love truth and acknowledge it. By recording these intense disputes and the subsequent concessions, the Mishnah proves that these weren't egotistical battles for political dominance. They were genuine, collaborative, high-stakes efforts to uncover the truth. It demonstrates that even the greatest intellectual titans must be willing to change their minds when presented with superior logic.
So you have all these categories, all these massive debates, this ocean of oral data floating around for centuries. The cognitive load was becoming unsustainable. Someone had to actually organize it. Which brings us to the man who built the architecture Maimonides is writing about. Let's talk about the compiler of the Mishnah, Rabbi Judah the Prince.
Historically, he is a fascinating anomaly.
Yeah.
He lived around the year 200 CE during a period of immense trauma for the Jewish people. The Romans had destroyed the temple, crushed the Bar Kokhba revolt, and initiated brutal persecutions. The physical centers of learning were constantly under threat.
And Judah the Prince, who was so universally respected, they just called him Rabbi, like a one-name rock star. He looks at the political landscape and realizes the oral tradition is in critical danger of being fragmented or lost.
Maimonides paints a vivid portrait of him. He possessed a staggering, almost paradoxical combination of traits. He was immensely wealthy. The Talmud compares his dining table to the king of Persia's. He held massive political power, maintaining a close strategic friendship with the Roman Emperor Antoninus. But despite this wealth and power, he was exceptionally wise and profoundly, deeply humble. The texts say of him, "From the days of Moses until Rabbi, we have not seen Torah and worldly greatness combined in one person."
He leverages his wealth, his political protection, and his intellect to undertake a massive editorial project. He gathers all the sages, collects the sprawling oral traditions, and structures them into a definitive, organized compilation, the Mishnah. But he didn't just alphabetize the laws, he designed an architecture.
He organized the entirety of Jewish law into 6 orders, comprising 61 tractates and 523 chapters.
And Maimonides argues that the sequence of these 6 orders is not random. It is deeply philosophical. It is essentially a blueprint for how to build a civilization from scratch. Let's explore this organically. The first order is called Zeraim, which translates to seeds, or agriculture. Why does the definitive code of Jewish spiritual and civil law begin with farming?
Maimonides gives a brutally pragmatic, almost Maslow-esque answer. Because you cannot serve God, you cannot philosophize, and you cannot hold court if you are starving to death. Food is the absolute foundational prerequisite for human existence. Before you can build a society, you must secure the food supply.
But inside that first order of agriculture, the very first tractate, chapter 1, page 1 of the entire Mishnah is called Barasha, which means blessings. Why start a farming manual with prayers?
Maimonides uses a beautiful medical analogy to explain Judah the Prince's editorial mindset. He compares Rabbi to an expert, compassionate physician treating a patient. A truly skilled doctor doesn't just immediately force harsh, bitter medicine down a patient's throat. First, they prescribe a proper, nourishing diet to strengthen the patient's constitution. Blessing your food, acknowledging the divine source of your sustenance, is the spiritual diet. It sets the proper state of mind before you even begin engaging with the grueling physical labor of the agricultural world.
Okay, so we have secured food. What's next in the sequence?
The second order is mode, which means festivals or appointed times. Once a society has food, it must learn to structure and sanctify time. Sabbaths, holidays, the rhythm of the year.
And then what?
Then we move to the interpersonal. The third order is nashim, women dealing with marriage, divorce, and family law. Followed immediately by the fourth order, nezikin, which covers civil law, torts, damages, courts, and criminal punishments.
Now, Maimonides asks a structural question here. Why place family law, nashim, directly before civil damages, nezikin?
Because, Maimonides points out, Judah the Prince is intentionally mirroring the narrative sequence of the biblical book of Exodus. In Exodus chapter 21, the text explicitly details the laws of a man selling his daughter into servitude, which falls under family and marital law, and immediately in the very next verses, it transitions to the laws of an ox goring a person or property, which is civil damages. The Mishnah aligns its structure with the underlying flow of the Torah.
But there is a massive structural surprise inside that fourth order, Nezikin. You are reading through dense, highly technical legal material about property lines, broken fences, goring oxen, unpaid loans, and court procedures. And stuffed right in the middle of this dry civil code is a tractate called Avat, or Ethics of the Fathers. It contains 0 laws. It is purely a collection of moral maxims, ethical advice, and deep philosophy. What is a book of ethics doing in the middle of a tort law textbook?
This is perhaps Maimonides' most profound insight into the mind of Judah the Prince, and it reveals his view on the nature of justice. Maimonides argues that ethics are placed in the civil law section because it is the judges who need morals more desperately than anyone else in society.
That is a chillingly accurate assessment of power.
It really is. If an average powerless citizen lacks ethics, they are a bad person. But the damage they can do is relatively localized. They might cheat a neighbor. But if a judge, a human being who holds the power of the state over people's money, property, freedom, and in the ancient world, their physical bodies via corporal punishment, if that person lacks profound moral grounding, they can destroy the entire fabric of society. They can pervert justice on a systemic level.
So Judah the Prince essentially staples the ethics manual to the judge's bench. You cannot read the laws of punishment without first reading the laws of humility and morality.
Precisely. And Maimonides expands on this, returning to his medical analogy to describe how a judge must operate. He says a judge must view the disputing parties not just as litigants, but as patients suffering from a societal sickness.
How does a judge treat them like a doctor?
A doctor always starts with the mildest possible intervention. If they can cure a minor ailment with mild food, diet, and rest, they do it. If that fails, they move to mild medicine, like soothing syrups. Only if the disease is vicious, stubborn, and life-threatening do they resort to harsh, bitter, toxic medicines to shock the system and purge the sickness.
So translating that to the courtroom.
The judge should first try to heal the dispute with the mild food of mediation and compromise. Try to get the two parties to reach an amicable agreement without resorting to strict law. If that fails, they move to mild medicine, applying the strict letter of the civil law, but doing so gently, with empathy and respect. But if the judge is facing a stubborn and wicked patient, a violent criminal, a remorseless fraudster, someone actively preying on the weak captain, the judge must not hesitate to use the harsh, bitter medicine of severe fines, public penalties, and strict punishments to protect the health of the society.
It transforms the Mishnah from a mere encyclopedia of rules into a grand architectural blueprint for civilization. First, you secure food. Then you organize time. Then you establish the family unit. Then you regulate the civil society, governed by intensely ethical judges. And only then, in the final 2 orders, do you move on to the temple rituals, kodashim, and spiritual purity, taharat.
It is a stunning logical progression. But here is the catch. You open this pristine, logically flawless architectural blueprint, you start reading the Talmudic commentary on it, and suddenly, without warning, you are reading a story about a sage having a conversation with a river, or arguing with a demon, or encountering a fish the size of a continent.
Yes, the Derashat, the Agada, the folklore, the metaphors, the wild, seemingly hallucinogenic stories scattered throughout the legal texts. How does Maimonides, the ultimate rationalist, reconcile these chaotic fairy tales with the precise legal machinery we just spent an hour discussing?
Maimonides addresses this with extreme urgency. He essentially gives his readers a stern warning regarding these stories. He says, do not, under any circumstances, read these stories literally.
Because if you read them literally, the sages sound like they've lost their minds.
Exactly. And Maimonides insists that these stories actually contain the most profound, advanced, philosophical, and divine truths in the entire corpus of Jewish thought. But they are deliberately hidden in the esoteric garb of bizarre folklore.
But why the need for such extreme esotericism? If these sages possess profound truths about the nature of the universe, why not just write them down clearly in a philosophical textbook? Why encode a lecture on metaphysics into a story about a flying camel?
Maimonides offers 2 primary reasons for this cryptography. The first is pedagogical. It's to challenge and sharpen the minds of the students. A difficult, confusing metaphor acts as an intellectual speed bump. It forces the diligent student to stop, become frustrated, and dig furiously beneath the surface. It's an intellectual puzzle designed to train the mind to look beyond the literal.
And the second reason?
The second is a protective measure. It is designed to hide advanced, complex truths from the foolish or the uneducated masses who would simply mock what they don't have the capacity to understand. He quotes a verse from the Song of Solomon. "Honey and milk are under your tongue." Maimonides interprets this metaphorically, meaning that the sweetest, most profound philosophical truths should be kept hidden under the tongue. They should not be spoken explicitly in the public square.
Because if you just hand a deeply complex concept to someone who lacks the foundational training to process it, they won't revere the truth, they will ridicule it, they will weaponize their own ignorance against the sage.
Precisely. And to illustrate this dynamic, Maimonides gives what I consider one of the most brilliant and enduring analogies in his entire introduction. It is an analogy drawn from astronomy.
Oh, I love this part. Set the scene for this because it perfectly captures his worldview.
Maimonides says, imagine you approach a completely uneducated person, a laborer who has never studied a day of mathematics, geometry, or science, and you casually mention to them, did you know that the sun in the sky is actually a massive sphere, and it is exactly 166 and 38 times larger than the Earth? And by the way, the Earth is a sphere with a circumference of roughly 24,000 miles.
If you say that to a medieval peasant, what is their reaction?
They were going to laugh in your face. They will think you are a complete lunatic. They will point at the sky and say, are you blind? The sun looks like it's the size of a copper coin, and the Earth is flat. How can a coin-sized object be 166 times larger than the ground I'm standing on?
Yeah.
To their untrained, purely sensory-driven mind, your factual statement sounds like absolute impossible nonsense.
Right, because their context is entirely visual.
Yes. But if you take a mathematician, a scholar who has spent years studying geometry, who understands parallax, who has painstakingly worked through Ptolemy's Almagest.
And we should define that Ptolemy's Almagest was the definitive, highly complex mathematical treatise on astronomy used throughout the medieval world. It was the absolute bleeding edge of astronomical math at the time.
Right. If you make that same statement to a scholar who has mastered the Almagest, to them, the size of the sun isn't a wild claim. It is an undeniable, easily demonstrable mathematical proof. They understand the underlying equations that make the conclusion inescapable.
So how does Maimonides connect this astronomy lesson back to the weird stories in the Talmud?
He is drawing a direct parallel. He is saying to the reader, when you encounter a story in the Talmud that sounds scientifically or logically absurd, you must realize that you are the peasant looking at the sun. The defect is in your intellect, not in the sage's text. The sage who authored that story is the master astronomer. They have encoded a profound metaphysical truth into that narrative. If it sounds like a silly fairy tale to you, it is simply because you lack the philosophical mathematics required to decode the metaphor.
It's an incredible defense of the intellectual dignity of his predecessors. It reminds me of trying to explain modern technology to someone from the past. Imagine trying to explain the internet to a 12th century knight. If you try to explain TCP/IP protocols, server farms, and fiber optic data transmission, their eyes will glaze over and they will dismiss you as a madman. But if you call the internet a magic mirror that lets you instantly see anywhere in the world, the metaphor sounds like a silly fairy tale to a modern engineer. But it is the only effective way to convey the function of complex data to an entirely unprepared mind. The sages were using magic mirrors to teach metaphysics.
That is exactly what they were doing. Maimonides is demanding that his readers approach these texts with intellectual humility. Assume the genius of the author and interrogate your own lack of understanding.
Which brings us to the final and undoubtedly the most controversial segment of our deep dive. We have explored the mechanics of the law, the resolution of disputes, the architecture of the Mishnah, and the secret codes of the sages. But now, Maimonides zooms out as far as a human mind can go. He looks at this massive, complex legal and philosophical structure and asks the ultimate teleological question. If the manual is this complex, what is the purpose of the human being reading it? Why are we here? What is the point of creation?
He begins this inquiry with a foundational premise, one that heavily synthesizes traditional Jewish theology with classical Aristotelian philosophy. Nature, and by extension God, makes absolutely nothing in vain. Every single entity in the physical universe has a specific, designated purpose for existing.
He even anticipates the immediate objection to this. He says, look at poisonous plants. He explicitly mentions a plant called bish, which scholars believe refers to aconite, a highly toxic, deadly plant. Or look at venomous snakes. A skeptic might ask, why would a purposeful God create organisms whose only apparent function is to kill humans?
And Maimonides answers that even these lethal elements have a profound purpose. He notes that if a skilled physician knows how to extract the toxins and compound them correctly, those exact poisons serve as critical poultices, painkillers, or antidotes. The venom has medicinal value. Nothing is superfluous.
So his logic builds a hierarchy. He argues that everything in the sublunary world, meaning everything under the orbit of the moon, the earth, the minerals, the plants, the animals, exists fundamentally to serve humanity. Whether it provides food, labor, or medicine, the lower ecosystems are designed to support the human ecosystem.
Okay, if the premise holds that the entire earthly ecosystem exists to serve humanity, the inescapable next question is, what is humanity's purpose? What is the function of the creature at the top of the pyramid?
And this is where Maimonides gets incredibly stark. He begins by defining what our purpose is not. He says the ultimate purpose of a human being is not eating, drinking, procreating, or building walls.
Why not? Many people would argue that survival, comfort, and building a legacy is exactly the point of life.
Because, Maimonides argues, we share every single one of those traits with animals. A bird builds an intricate nest. A spider spins a mathematically perfect web. A lion hunts and eats. If humanity's ultimate purpose was just physical survival, biological reproduction, and constructing comfortable shelters, we would be nothing more than highly efficient, slightly more complicated beasts. Our unique purpose must be fundamentally tied to our unique capacity, the one thing we possess that animals do not.
And that unique capacity is the intellect, the rational soul.
Precisely. For Maimonides, the sole overriding purpose of a human being's existence is to acquire intellectual truth, and specifically, the highest possible truth, comprehending the philosophical and theological reality of the unity of God. A human who does not develop their intellect, who spends their entire life solely pursuing physical desires and material wealth, is, in Maimonides' notoriously harsh phrasing, quote, just a beast with the power of speech.
It is a radically, unapologetically intellectualist worldview. The perfection of the abstract mind is the only true human achievement. Everything else is just biology.
But Maimonides is brilliant. He immediately anticipates the massive, glaring counterargument to this philosophy. He asks a highly provocative question. If the entire singular point of the human species is to produce brilliant philosopher sages who spend their days contemplating the unity of God, why did God create so many people who aren't philosophers?
It is the ultimate teleological stress test. If nature does nothing in vain, what is the purpose of the vast, overwhelming majority of the human race who have neither the time, the inclination, nor the capacity to achieve intellectual perfection? What is the purpose of the non-philosopher?
And Maimonides gives two reasons. And I have to be honest, if you are a modern reader, these reasons can be very difficult to swallow. Reason number one, the masses exist to maintain the physical infrastructure of the world.
Let's unpack his logic here. He points out the sheer logistical nightmare of human survival. It takes an entire lifetime of dedicated apprenticeship just to learn how to cultivate wheat, millet, and bake bread properly. It takes a lifetime to learn how to build a sturdy house or weave complex textiles or forge iron tools.
So his argument is that if every single human being retreated to a mountaintop to engage in isolated philosophical contemplation, humanity would starve to death and freeze in a matter of weeks.
Exactly. So he says the masses essentially exist to perform the immense manual labor required to keep civilization running, so that the rare, brilliant philosopher has the free time, the food, and the shelter necessary to actually sit and think.
Wow. He actually goes on a tangent critiquing what he calls the madness of the common man. He paints this vivid, almost cynical picture of a merchant. This merchant travels across dangerous oceans, risking drowning, fighting pirates, enduring disease, all to earn some gold coins. And what does he do with the gold? He spends years building a massive, opulent stone mansion. And Maimonides points out the absurdity. This merchant knows he is a mortal being. He knows his body is decaying and he will die soon, yet he builds a house designed to last 1,000 years.
And Maimonides asks the teleological question. Why does God implant this seemingly irrational drive for massive wealth and endless building in the minds of the masses? His answer is chillingly pragmatic. He says God implants this drive so that one day, maybe decades after the merchant is dead, a true sage might be walking through that town, fleeing persecution, or simply needing shade from the brutal sun. And that sage will be able to rest against the sturdy stone wall of that very mansion, and his life will be saved so he can continue philosophizing. Maimonides quotes the biblical book of Job to summarize this: "The wicked prepares, and the righteous wears it."
Okay, I have to step in here and challenge this entire premise. If I'm listening to this today in a modern democratic society that values human equality, I am screaming at my audio player right now. This sounds like a ruthlessly utilitarian simulation where 99% of humans are just functional tools of the ecosystem. It sounds incredibly arrogant to suggest that the entirety of a normal person's life, their loves, their fears, their grueling labor, their family, is completely meaningless except for the fact that they incidentally baked a loaf of bread that a philosopher might eat.
Your reaction is entirely valid. It is a profound shock to modern sensibilities. Maimonides is operating within a deeply Aristotelian framework that views the universe as a hierarchy of function. But to fairly evaluate his stance, we have to look very closely at how he defines this elite philosopher versus the ignorant masses.
Please clarify that, because right now it sounds like a horrific caste system.
It is crucial to understand that in Maimonides' view, this hierarchy is not based on bloodline. It is not based on race or nobility or inherited wealth or genetics. It is entirely meritocratic and, most importantly, volitional. Anyone can choose to become the sage.
So it's an open invitation. You can opt into the highest level of purpose.
Exactly. When Maimonides refers to the masses as ignorant or wicked, he isn't insulting their inherent human worth. He is issuing a blistering critique of their choices. The ignorant are those who voluntarily surrender their unique divine potential, their intellect, in order to chase fleeting, meaningless physical pleasures.
He is attacking materialism.
Yes, he is saying, you have the incredible neurological hardware to perceive the divine reality of the universe, but instead of using it, you are wasting your one precious life hoarding shiny rocks and building bigger dining rooms. He is saying that if you choose to live solely for material accumulation, you're actively reducing yourself to a mere functional cog in the biological ecosystem, rather than realizing your potential to transcend it.
That reframes it significantly. It makes it less of an aristocratic insult and more of a tragic lament over squandered human potential. You could be contemplating the stars, but you're obsessed with the mud.
Precisely. And this understanding leads directly to his second reason for why the masses must exist. Reason number 2, to provide the social fabric that keeps the wise company.
That almost sounds condescending, like the masses are just pets to keep the philosopher from getting lonely.
Not pets, but an essential psychological anchor. Maimonides is an acute observer of human psychology. He acknowledges a dark reality about genius. True sages, people who've actually reached the absolute pinnacle of intellectual and spiritual perfection, are vanishingly rare. He quotes the mystic Rabbi Shimon bar Yochai, who famously said, "I have seen the sons of ascent, and they are few."
If you were operating on a completely different intellectual plane than everyone else, life has to be incredibly isolating.
Exactly. Maimonides argues that if the world were only populated by these few, scattered, brilliant sages, they would go insane from the sheer, crushing loneliness of their existence. The human mind, even a perfect one, requires community. They need the infrastructure of a society, the hum and chaos of humanity around them, the normal interactions of the marketplace to remain grounded and mentally stable. The masses provide the vital social gravity that prevents the sage from floating off into total psychological isolation.
It is a sweeping, complex, and unyielding vision of reality. Every single atom of the universe, from the toxic sap of a deadly plant to the legal mechanics of a debt forgiveness loophole to the merchant sailing through a hurricane for gold, is a gear in a massive cosmic machine. And that machine is designed to produce one singular output: human wisdom, the intellectual knowledge of God. Even the performance of the religious commandments themselves, the dietary laws, the festivals are only valuable because they discipline the body and subdue physical desires, thereby creating the quiet, focused space in the mind necessary to achieve that ultimate intellectual perfection.
It is the ultimate synthesis. The legal structure is the tool. The perfection of the intellect is the singular goal.
Let's take a breath and recap the incredible intellectual ground we've covered today. We started by opening a manual written 8 centuries ago and immediately confronted the logistical genius of the ancient world. We watched as the rote, 4-step memorization process at Mount Sinai shattered the modern myth of the telephone game, proving that oral history can be an exact science.
We then explored how Maimonides stripped prophets of their legal authority, demanding miracles be separated from jurisprudence, essentially placing the lock on the law and handing the keys entirely to human reason.
We dissected the anatomy of legal disagreement, seeing how variations in cognitive processing power, not amnesia, led to the debates of the Talmud, and why minority dissenting opinions are preserved like intellectual time capsules for future generations.
We marveled at the architectural genius of Rabbi Judah the Prince, who structured the Mishnah as a progressive blueprint for society, intentionally placing the burden of ethics squarely on the shoulders of the judges.
We decoded the esoteric astronomy analogies, learning to see the profound metaphysics hidden beneath the bizarre folklore of the sages.
And finally, we confronted a staggering teleological worldview where the entire physical universe exists merely as a support system to facilitate the intellectual elevation of the human mind.
It is a breathtaking intellectual achievement. But as we close this deep dive, I want to leave you with a final provocative thought, a paradox to ponder on your own.
Maimonides claims forcefully that the ultimate human purpose is pure, isolated intellectual perfection. It sounds like a demand for a monastic dedication to the mind, a complete retreat from the trivialities, politics, and mundane labor of the physical world.
Yet look at the actual life of the man who wrote those words. Moses Maimonides did not live in a quiet ivory tower. He lived a life of frantic, exhausting action. He served as the primary, desperately busy physician to the vizier of the Sultan in Cairo, Egypt. He spent his days diagnosing fevers and mixing medicines. Furthermore, he was the recognized head of the Jewish community. He spent hours every single night exhausted answering thousands of letters from ordinary people asking him basic questions about business disputes, marriage, and daily life.
He was a man deeply, inextricably enmeshed in the messy, physical, demanding world of the very ignorant masses he wrote about with such critique. He lived the exact opposite of the isolated philosopher's life he idealizes in his own introduction.
So, here is the paradox to wrestle with. Does achieving true intellectual perfection actually require us to abandon the world and retreat into the mind? Or is it possible that Maimonides knew a deeper truth? Is it possible that the ultimate expression of wisdom is found precisely by stepping back into the messiness, the noise, the labor, and the everyday struggles of the world we supposedly transcend? If the manual tells you the goal is to touch the stars, why did the author spend his entire life healing broken bodies in the mud? Think about that as you go about your day.